Hello and welcome to the New Republic Salon. I'm Laura Marsh. I'm the literary editor of the New Republic, and today I'm talking with Lauren Oyler about her novel Fake Accounts. Lauren, it's great to see you. How are you doing?
It's great to see you too. I'm doing great. Still in this Airbnb in Williamsburg, so enjoying.
Oh, really?
Yes, yeah. So I got stuck here for like an extra 6 days or something. So
Is this because of snow?
yes, yeah, and
I
snow
see.
in Ithaca too, where we live.
Okay. I can imagine that would be a bigger problem there.
Yes.
So, but you're on a virtual book tour, but
Mhm.
you still had to physically change your location to do that.
It's the
How
worst
does
of
that
both.
work?
It's the worst of both worlds. Well, I mean, we just have a car. I came to New York just to sign some books and then, eat via a restaurant and then
To order takeout
to
from
order
something that
different
was in New
takeout.
York.
Yeah, and then it snowed on the day that we were leaving, and then it kept snowing. So I'm just in this. This is why I have my. This is why I don't have any books behind me for people to judge.
Right. I feel like, well, you're on like a sort of like literal version of the internet.
Yes.
Behind you is just a white space.
Nothing here. Yeah, it's all about me as well.
So the way that I usually do these salons is we start with a reading and then talk, and then another reading and then talk. And then at the end, there'll be a Q&A. So if you're in the audience and at any point you think the questions I'm asking just aren't good enough, or you have something that you want to ask Lauren, there is a Q&A box on the bottom of Zoom and you can type in questions. So I can pull questions from there at the end as if this were a real Q&A, and I'll ask them for you. So Lauren, do you want to start with the first reading?
Yes, absolutely. This is just from the beginning of the novel, so I don't think I need to do. We can do the synopsis after, I guess. Consensus was the world was ending, or would begin to end soon. If not by exponential environmental catastrophe, then by some combination of nuclear war, the American two-party system, patriarchy, white supremacy, gentrification, globalization, data breaches, and social media. People looked sad on the subway, in the bars. Decisions were questioned, opinions rearranged. The same grave epiphany was dragged around everywhere. We were transitioning from an only retrospectively easy past to an arguably more difficult future. We were, it can no longer be denied, unstoppably bad. Although the death of any hope for humanity was surely decades in the making, the result of many intersecting systems described forbiddingly well, it was only that short period between the election of a new president and his holding up a hand to swear to serve the people's interests that made clear what had happened, that we were too late. I didn't believe all this necessarily, though as the news got worse and more bizarre, I wavered. I've always been drawn to pragmatism, just not exactly a natural at it. As my brain says, calm down, my heart says, also weirdly calmly, a paradoxical comfort can be found in drama. It was and still is my official position, if you were to ask me at a party or something, that the popular turn to fatalism could be attributed to self-aggrandizement and an ignorance of history, history being characterized by the population's quickness to declare apocalypse finally imminent, despite its permanently delayed arrival. We don't want to die, but we also don't want to do anything challenging, such as what living requires, so the volubility with which certain doom was discussed made a tedious kind of sense. The end of the world would let us have our cake and eat it too. We would have no choice but to die, our potential conveniently unrealizable due to our collapse. Until such time, the idea that everything was totally pointless now was seductive, particularly as a mantra you could take advantage of when it suited you and abandon when life actually started to feel alarming. I myself was soon using it to indulge some of my naughtier impulses, by which I mean that in the first hours of a morning in early January, when the sky was still dark and the government was still inevitably hurtling, I decided to snoop through my boyfriend's phone while he was asleep. I'd never really had the urge to go through another person's things before. After a few disappointing experiences with high school boyfriends' instant message histories, I learned that poking around the byproducts of other people's thoughts usually yielded the mundane, the predictable, and the unattractive. Even with men I respected intellectually, I never found myself caring enough to breach their trust. Before Felix, my boyfriends exuded the wholesome, loving, deep-down reliability of hot dads on television shows, despite being, as far as I knew, not hot, nor dads, nor on television. Another way of putting this is that before Felix, I had good taste. But over the year and a half we'd been together, Felix had revealed himself to be completely unrevealing, insisting over and over as I baited and nagged and implored him to tell me his innermost hopes, fears, and childhood formed biases, either that there was nothing to tell, or, conflictingly, that he told me everything already and it wasn't his fault if I didn't remember. It was humiliating and typical, and per the usual narrative, I assumed he was hiding something, probably other women. And I'll stop there.
So do you want to do the synopsis part now?
Sure. So this is the beginning of Fake Accounts, and the narrator, who remains unnamed, is about to snoop through her boyfriend's phone, as I just said. And what she finds is not that he is having an affair, but that he is operating a pretty popular conspiracy theory account on Instagram, where he posts a sort of variety of conspiracy theory memes, and he has tens of thousands of followers, and he's very active on it. And she is like, oh, I thought he had sort of given up social media in a big show of like his beliefs, and it turns out the reason he's been so weird is because he is doing something completely weird. So she decides to dump him, but she wants to dump him in the most perfect way, and her sort of procrastination leads to an unexpected event, I guess you could say.
I love this scene, which you don't quite get to in that reading, of her actually figuring out how to get into his phone.
Oh yes.
Which takes up quite a lot of space in the novel. It's like very, very detailed. What gave you the idea for that?
Well, certainly not personal experience, but if I had wanted to sneak into a boyfriend's phone, say, I think I had, gamed it out, right? And how would you do it? And you could do it. What she ends up doing is just looking over his shoulder while he's typing in the numerical pass code. But she's also like, what I really could have done if I wanted to is put his fingerprint on the fingerprint sensor. But she's too, afraid to do that. So basically she watches him type out the password and eventually waits for an opportunity for him to leave his phone alone, so that she can type it in herself.
I'm sure no one who reads your book will be able to relate to having done
No,
that.
I don't know. I don't know that has ever actually happened. It was just, world building, as they say.
I'm always curious where a novel begins. Was there a particular scene that was kind of in your head and that the book grew from?
I thought of the whole plot. So there are two twists, I guess, right? And I think what I really wanted to do was to write something that had this kind of apocalyptic structure and then subvert it. So I really like books where the reader knows what a bad thing has happened or is about to happen, and then the book is you're learning how it comes to be. And I liked the idea. First of all, I thought it would be quite funny for the bad thing that we know that is going to happen is that this woman is going to dump her boyfriend, because obviously this is like a thing that feels very momentous when it's happening to you, but actually doesn't really matter and nobody else cares at all. And then when she can't dump him, I guess this is not really a spoiler, many people put this in interviews, so before she can dump him, he dies in a bicycle accident. So I thought it would be quite interesting for her to have to deal with these unusual emotions when she's been sort of plotting to do the perfect breakup, more or less, and then he dies.
The setting of the book is in this very specific window of time between, like, just leading up to Trump's election, although no one really talks about that side of things in the book, for which I was very grateful. Yeah. And then like kind of the first few months of the Trump administration, or maybe the first year. What drew you to that as the period of time in which all this should happen?
Well, I was very, I think, interested in this sort of gloom and doom that everybody thought that the world was going to end, and everybody was speaking very, very in grave apocalyptic terms. So I was interested in this like real melodramatic or dramatic, atmosphere that was going on. And I think I wanted to do something with the Women's March because I found the Women's March to be particularly interesting as a kind of as a comparison point for how social media works in general, and to sort of like think about how social media made the Women's March in a lot of ways, and also why the Women's March was the way that it was, thinking in the context of the way people were writing about it in articles and posting about it online. But I also just noticed, I think around that time, and I wrote the novel more or less, not quite live, but I started at the beginning of 2017 and I finished it in 2018. Just the sort of hyperbolic way people were talking, I found a lot of it quite dishonest. And I was really interested in trying to think about whether people believed what they were saying in a bunch of various different contexts. So the conspiracy theory guy is an obvious sort of extreme example of this kind of like, you can't possibly believe what you're telling all of these people, right? And then what's more horrifying, that he's obviously lying, or that he does, buy what he's selling.
It's interesting to me that you have this scene or set of scenes at the Women's March, because it's a very earnest event.
Mm-hmm.
Did you go to it?
I did go to it, yeah.
So some of this that was like almost research for the novel.
Yeah, and I think when I went, I didn't know that I was going to put it in necessarily, but I went more, that the sort of reasoning is like, I wasn't going to go, and then everybody was going, and it was like, oh, it's weird actually if you don't go. And my friend had a house that I could stay at, so I went with her. And yeah, the scene, the protagonist sort of goes very skeptically, but she's like, oh, I should go because everybody is going. And she goes and she goes alone as well. So she's in this huge crowd of people. She's totally by herself, and she's sort of overwhelmed by the scale and the fact that she could see, but both by looking at social media and just by being in DC at that time, that there was just like an endless iterations of this huge groups of people going out, basically forever all around the world. And I thought that was a very rare example of a moment in life where you can like experience the sort of overwhelming scale of what happens on social media too.
When people have talked about this novel to me, or when people were sort of anticipating it coming out, one thing they kept coming back to is this is a novel about kind of like what it's like to live online. It's a novel about the internet, but it's a novel about a specific version of the internet, right? How do you define the version of the internet that's in this book?
Yeah, I think that it is. I think it's maybe more sort of useful to think about it as a sort of comedy of manners, as some people have said, and to think about the internet as like where many of this sort of people of this milieu often hang out, or where they spend a lot of their time, right? So I think there's sort of upper middle class creative millennials, more or less, right? If we were in Europe, we would call them the easy jet set. and she sort of partakes of that kind of stuff as well, even though she's in the US. But they're this sort of global, like sort of precarious, but not actually working in the culture industries, working in tech, working in media, things like that. And who are sort of cosmopolitan, but also like quite alienated, I think. And that's why they're online all the time.
Thinking about a moment, maybe 10 years ago, probably like right at when you were starting to think about writing criticism,
Mm-hmm.
when there was a sense of anxiety about including the internet in a work of fiction. I remember Laura Miller had an essay about this and how people were like writing historical fiction almost as if to avoid having a cell phone or like a laptop. What did you feel? I mean, did you feel like this was an intervention in that? Did you feel like there was something that wasn't being done?
Yeah, I mean, I think even, I also want to say I haven't read every single, I'm sure there are other novels that do it really well. I just have not read them. But I was noticing that as time went on, there was still this kind of historical fiction, or there were sort of convenient avoidances of the internet, right? So there's like, it's taking place in the early 2000s, or someone's phone is broken, or like there will be people texting or people emailing, but it's really not, the way that they're texting, emailing is not that they're interacting with the technology. It's basically like they're interacting with a lamp, right? And not an iPhone. And I think quite naturally, number one, there's an idea that novelists should not be spending a lot of their time on social media because it will ruin your brain, and it will take time away from that you need to write your novel. So I understand why probably a lot of novelists simply do not know what's going on in the computer. And what I think is that it's quite great material for a novel. You really just have to watch people. You can just watch. I mean, the people watching is incredible online if you know where to look. And also, I think the fear is that it will be boring to detail all of the things that you're doing with your phone naturally, because it is boring when you're doing it.
Mm-hmm. Well, that is a writing problem, right? Is that something you came up against in the writing of the novel? Here's something that my character's going to do, but actually this is so boring, I can't bring myself to do it.
I just tried to make it really realistic. Like I tried to think about, like, when I was at the Women's March, how many times was I checking my phone trying to get it to my text messages to go through? I was text messaging with a couple of people at the time. So like, what's the deal? And I think when she's walking, there's a scene where she's walking from her yoga studio into her house, and she's like texting Felix, her boyfriend, the entire time, right? And then I sort of have her, she says, now you don't get to know what the walk looks like because I was texting the entire time, right? So I was trying to keep the action in the sort of physical realm, right? Even if what she's doing is all on the phone, because I think that is a way to sort of ground it. And also I think that's just realistically how we use our phones. I think we're always still aware of like being hunched over on the computer or whatever for several hours at a time, and then you're like looking up and you're like, actually I'm hurting my eyes by doing this, right? So yeah, I mean, I just tried to keep it in scene even when there are riffs and things going on.
That's interesting too. I hadn't thought about it, but obviously so much of the book is about travel and moving, as well as just being on the phone. So it kind of, you always have that tension.
Yeah. And I think too, that she's like quite, she's seeking something. She's distraught, I think, for a lot of different reasons. And hopefully that gives, there's some momentum, because I think she's using the phone in a particularly desperate way. So hopefully when she's using it, she's like looking for something, as so many people are, I think, on Twitter or Instagram or whatever.
And I get the sense in the novel that she is, I mean, I think you do a good job of showing that she is on the extreme end of a spectrum. Like there are people she knows who are not doing this.
Yes.
Who are like still young, normal people, but they maybe like check their phone 4 times an hour instead of like 4 times every 10 minutes.
Right.
You are facing like a particularly extreme form of engagement with that technology. Like I think there's a part early in the book where the character says that she's like a lab rat in the experiment with the lowest rewards.
Yes.
Was it kind of, do you feel like you went to a sort of a dark place in documenting it? I mean, what was that process like?
I feel
because a lot of people are trying to move away from it. They know they do it, they're trying not to.
Yeah, I mean, I honestly feel like sometimes I look at Twitter now, or things will happen to me online, or I sort of see things happening online, and I'm like, I wish I could have done it. I could have gone way more. but I'm like, I need to write another novel that's about Twitter at the end of 2020, because it's so much more extreme. And I think one of the things that the challenges that I liked about the book was that I wanted to put it just on this border between believable and unbelievable. And I wanted it all to be realistic. It could happen. And it seems like, if you know this part of the internet, something that totally would happen, and your response to it would be almost this like numb disbelief and like feeling like someone is controlling this timeline, as we say on Twitter. And in terms of the like her sad addicted, the sort of long passages where she's riffing about what's going on the phone and how it makes her feel loved, for lack of a better word. Yeah, I unfortunately think I could go longer. I think I could do more.
Right. So I read another interview you gave where you were talking about the boyfriend's behavior, the conspiracy theorist boyfriend, and feeling like this now seemed like a very mild, like a harmless little account that he was running because of the way things have changed. Do you feel like in some ways the book is almost historical fiction?
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to make it so that when all this stuff changes, there are things in it that endure, but you understand that it's taking place at a very specific moment and the details come from that moment. And that's why it doesn't feel dated, because you read a novel from the 70s or the 19th century or whatever, and you're like, you just ignore the parts that you don't really understand because you understand that that's a 19th century thing that I could look it up and read a paper about it, but I'm not going to. So theoretically, that's what I did. And then I think with the conspiracy theory part in particular, I was like, occasionally nervous that something would happen that would make it all irrelevant and people would, it would just seem sort of quaint. And I think from one perspective, the fact that he's kind of into the conspiracy, he's doing it, but then he quite quickly, nothing ever comes of it, right? And we don't know what's going to happen with the conspiracy theories, but I think we're watching all of these QAnon people sort of try to decide what their next move is, and like, are they betrayed? Are they just going to sort of drop it as this thing that they were doing for a time period?
I'm trying to get the chronology straight in my own head. During the time that you were writing, or at least doing the first draft, had Pizzagate already happened? Was that happening as you were writing it?
Pizzagate happened right before I started. So Pizzagate happened at the end of 2016, but QAnon did not start until the events of the novel have concluded. So the novel finishes in June 2017 and QAnon starts, I think, in October 2017. So from that perspective, it's like, I was like, oh, great. And, QAnon doesn't need to appear in here. Because I, like the narrator of the book, don't find the sort of details of the conspiracy, the specific stories that interesting. And I find it quite hard to read a lot about the ins and outs of them and to read like all of these people's different ideas about them. But what I think is interesting is the structure of them and how the stories work. And that's how they sort of convince people that they're real, and also how they sort of take in new followers and things like that.
Well, should we go to the next reading? Because I think that does show us what this woman cares about.
Okay, yes, sure. Herself. Another spoiler. Okay, so should I introduce where this comes from, or we can talk about it afterwards?
However you prefer, before or after, I think.
Well, I'll introduce it sort of elliptically, which is to say that I think of this little section as a parable about social media. Okay. When I was 7 years old, my mother took me to see the film adaptation of Louise Fitzhugh's 1964 classic children's novel, Harriet the Spy. The movie starred Michelle Trachtenberg as a sixth grader who keeps a notebook of spy observations, which include field notes on missions or breaking and entering, as well as mean commentary on her friends and family. The notebook is a classic black and white marbled composition book with the word private taped over the front. This mandate is ignored by the rich popular bully, Marion Hawthorne, who finds the notebook while Harriet and her friends, Janie and Sport, are playing in a park. Marion, in a precocious houndstooth blazer, gathers the class around and begins to read aloud to the tiny Michelle Trachtenberg's freckled distress. The only thing more pathetic than being Marion Hawthorne, Marion begins in her taunting nasal sing-song, is wanting to be Marion Hawthorne. Janie and Sport try to stop her, but their entreaties only spur Marion to flip the pages detailing to their own shortcomings. Janie really creeps me out. I wonder if she'll grow up to be a total nutcase. Sport is so poor that he can't even afford food. Why can't his father just get a real job? If I was the boy with the purple socks, I'd hang myself, etc. Harriet's friends abandon her, joining a collective spy catcher club to prevent her from carrying out her missions. Her parents confiscate her notebook after her grades drop, and eventually there's a Carrie-esque scene involving blue paint. Harriet begins to enact cruel, specific revenge made possible by her sleuthing campaigns on all the kids individually, deepening their animosity toward her. It sounds dark, and it is. The resolution happy ending only arrives after Harriet's former nanny, Rosie O'Donnell, advises her to apologize to everyone and to lie about how she didn't mean the cruel things she wrote. When I saw this as a child, I didn't take away the lessons intended, which were that lying or omitting the truth is sometimes necessary to maintain friendships, and that if you're going to keep a private notebook, you should be careful about where you leave it. Instead, I began to fantasize about undergoing Harriet's dramatic ordeal myself. The idea that everyone I knew might care about my private thoughts was appealing, as was the possibility of people knowing my negative internal monologue without my having to tell them it. When the class became obsessed with making Harriet miserable, all I could see was that they were obsessed. I asked my mother to get me a black and white composition notebook and began to write down all the mean stuff I could think of. My report focused specifically on one friend, Kayla, who lived down the street. I wrote that she had stringy hair and that I never had fun when my mom made me spend the night at her house. We had recently begun painting our nails ourselves, and I wrote that I found it disturbing that she painted her toenails with horizontal strokes instead of vertical ones. A day later, I went over to Kayla's house with my notebook ostentatiously guarded at my chest. "This is my private notebook," I told her. "I got it yesterday. You can't look at it." She asked what I wrote in it. "None of your business," I said. After we spent some time on her swing set, I left the notebook in the yard and went home. Soon after, my mother received a call from Kayla's mother saying that Kayla had read my abandoned private notebook and was crying. I can't remember if I was punished. It's possible I wasn't, but I do remember panicking as soon as I realized that what I'd done would have consequences beyond being sent to my room. I had ceded my thoughts in exchange for becoming the focus of attention, and now I had less control over who I was to other people. Kayla and her mother would forever see me a certain way, as a careless little bitch who didn't know what she was talking about. But a careless little bitch who didn't know what she was talking about is actually not as bad as what I was. Someone who would rather other people think of her as a careless little bitch who didn't know what she was talking about than not think of her at all.
It's a very ostentatious reading of Harriet the Spy.
Yes.
So I think what really comes across in that reading is the voice in the novel, which kind of teeters on dislikability, but also so much bravado that it's kind of hard not to get carried away in it. It does remind me of your voice, like on Twitter and in criticism. How did you go about kind of working that up for the novel? I mean, how much did you feel like, I don't want it to be like my essays, or I want it to have this other thing?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's this, at least for me, this moment when I was working on it and I was struggling with the voice, and it was like a little bit too serious at times, or I was trying to do third person for a while, which was ridiculous because I love first person. I just had this moment when I was like, I love first person novels. That's what I should do. And I was thinking a lot about autofiction and the sorts of issues around that, and the idea that it was sort of a dead end at this point, which was 4 years ago. And how are we going to move on from whatever this is? So I think I just at some point I wrote the first version of the very first paragraph in the book, and I was like, oh, this is the voice, because it's really, it does have a lot of that bravado, and it is like a version of my voice, but it's really like me going for it and trying not to sort of second guess she's obviously aware of her audience, but if I were writing all of this, it would be like, this person is a menace to society, needs to stop, and it would be that you would be true. So I think I just tried to go for it, and there are always these moments, I think probably a lot of novelists have this, where you write something that would be you would think it would be true until you thought about it, and then you're like, actually no, I don't believe that. But what's amazing about a novel is that you can just leave it in there and it's character, you know? Mm-hmm. And I found that, I said to some viewer that I found the idea that people would, you know, maybe try and say that the narrator was me quite empowering, because I just know I have this understanding of the relationship between the narrator and myself that just makes sense to me. I'm sorry if that's sort of fake, but
No. Well, it's interesting
useful.
because partly what you're saying is that you toned down your own voice to get to this.
Yeah, for sure. For sure.
Because I think most people would be arriving at this by turning the volume up. Like it's a pretty, like I think I used the word before, ostentatious, but it is quite a bold voice. It reminds me a little bit of the protagonist in My Year of Rest and Relaxation, who's kind of goading you to dislike her.
Yeah, and I think I don't mean that I toned down. Wait, you're saying I toned down my.
You said if you wrote it as Lauren Oyler, right, it would be like a menace.
Well, if she were literally me, that would be bad, right?
Yes.
We have to accept.
Well, I don't know, maybe not.
Difference, right? And there is definitely, there's lots of difference, I think, but the voice that it's like a voice that has less concern, less second guessing, I guess, even though that sounds ridiculous because so much of it is second guessing. But I think when I'm writing an essay or just talking to someone, I try and get it right, the first time, as opposed to going back and forth as the narrator does. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense, because I mean, a work of criticism is kind of the finished thing. You don't always want to show how you got to every thought, but in the novel, that's the experience of being in the consciousness of the
processing
character.
Lots of things throughout the book, I think, and that is part of the narrative.
There's a fair amount of overlap in your biography and the character. One part is this company, which to me sounds a lot like Vice. I'm sure that I think you may have even referred to it as being like Vice, the place where she works, the kind of bloggy place. And throughout the book, she, sometimes sort of satirically thinks up her life in the headlines of the way the site might have written it. How much did you feel like that early experience of writing on the internet, like writing for Bookslut, writing for Vice, has fed into the voice of the novel and like just your MO as a writer?
Yeah, I think, first of all, it definitely, I think, contributes to my belief that it's sort of hopeless to try and live in a death of the author world, because we are in such a different reality, that I think I was interested in sort of pressing on and emphasizing the fact that I'm very Googleable. If you want to Google me, if you don't want to Google me, I hope and I think that you can still enjoy the book more or less the same way. But if you have this extra layer of knowledge, I was trying to basically play around with the fact that some readers will be familiar with my tweets or whatever, my writing, but without actually like ceding any ground on that point in the end. And I think too, the experience of writing for those websites is not all bad. And certainly like a career was made, so I can't be too terribly resentful about them. But
well, here's something I'm curious about. I've been curious about for a long time.
Okay.
Did the outlets encourage in you a kind of willingness to say things other people were less comfortable saying, and to really like push hard on your arguments? Because you're a polemicist, or you kind of work in that mode that a lot of critics do not go to. Or was that always your instinct and you ended up at these places?
Oh, I think it was always my instinct. I think that I think it was always my instinct. I don't have like a sort of formative moment. I think I was always just sort of shocked by this sort of relative gentility of so much of the culture sphere when I finished college. I mean, when I was in college, obviously it was very genteel at Yale, but it sort of seems like it's supposed to be genteel there. And then you get out and you're like, oh, all of these people are writing for these magazines, still being very safe. And like, I don't know, I was just had this very sort of naive, constant realization that everybody was lying or something, misrepresenting things. And I was living in Berlin when I graduated and started writing this top 10 list for Dazed Digital, which is the website for Dazed and Confused. And I started reading the LRB all the time because I was doing research about various things. And I just started reading all these old LRB articles. And I think that that's like actually where a lot of my willingness to do sort of, I mean, I don't even think my articles are that outrageous, but to be a little bit more, to not be fearful of being super critical at times when I think that it's warranted.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, it's funny because I feel like there is this ongoing discussion about like the death of the negative book review.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact is, since at least the 1950s that I'm aware of, there have been long essays devoted to the idea that no one is going to do negative book reviews anymore. And the reality is there's always a few people who will do them really well. And then a few people who will only review books they think are good and just push the others aside. And then like a lot of people where you honestly don't know, do they like this book that's not good, or do they just feel like they've got to be nice? And that to me is more puzzling than like, oh, how could someone hate this? Because at least if they didn't like it, they usually make a pretty strong case, like, here's why it's bad.
Yes.
It feels, I mean, I'm curious if you think it feels almost easier to feel like you have an argument if you're going to do a takedown, because you're going in with an agenda when you sit down to write the piece.
Yeah. And I think there's always like, I would never do a takedown of a book that was also unpopular. I would never even bother to do a takedown of like a conservative book just because I simply don't care. And it seems to me quite obvious why the book is bad, right? Like, I'm only going to write one of those pieces if it seems like the ecosystem, it's lacking in the world, and it's correct. But also that the person is very, can stand on their own, and a takedown is not going to hurt them in any material way, right? So from that standpoint, I am not like with my, knife, like machete in the floor, whatever. I think not to answer, this wasn't a question you asked, but I think that the hardest kind of review to write is like a middling, like,
an appreciation.
I don't care one way or another, really. Like, you put it, it's over. The book is there. That's the hardest kind of
right. So yeah, the other kind of writing that strikes me that you've done, but not talked about as much, is that you've written books for other people or with other people. So this is your first novel, but it's not the first book you've written, which is kind of, to me, remarkable. It's remarkable to have written one book, let alone several. How do you feel like the act of having written those books before, of having already done it, fed into your process in any way, or are they two completely separate exercises for you?
I do see them as pretty separate, and I would say that both the sort of blogging, but also writing for magazines and ghostwriting, both of those things you have to write quite quickly, and you can't really be precious about it. So I think that helped me be like, well, now that I have a theoretically infinite amount of time to work on this novel, I can make it like 20 times better than a blog book. I can just I don't have to. It was a nice balance of not being too precious about it, but also feeling like I was free rather than feeling daunted by the fact that I was going to write 90,000 words. And when I ghostwrite, I almost always do it on a pretty tight deadline. So I'll like write one of those books in like 6 weeks or something.
Oh, that's amazing.
Yeah, it's very satisfying too, and like really fun. I don't really feel, not, I like all of the people I've worked with, but I don't feel like it's writing a book. Like, I feel like I'm like someone's accountant, and I just have this like particular skill that they appreciate that I have. So yeah, I'll do it pretty fast, and that's extremely satisfying because then you have obviously written 75,000 words in 6 weeks. So when you do that and you're like, oh, I can write a novel, I think it does have a very nice psychological effect.
Well, it interested me because this book inhabits different modes at certain points. I'm thinking particularly of, and I think this is a spoiler because it's a formal point, but I'm thinking particularly of the part of the book where you kind of shift into this almost parody of a fragmentary novel, like a kind of Kate Zambrino, Jenny Ortho kind of style. It seemed like that came very naturally to you to kind of nest that within a very traditional novel.
Yeah, I think it was very fun. I mean, it was very fun for that reason. And I think I liked the transition was that it came from, she was listening to an author be interviewed on a podcast, and they say, oh, I wrote my book in this way. And they have this like really sort of elaborate meaning for why they've written their book in that way. And she's like, I don't really buy it. You know, I don't really like this kind of book. It's very trendy. And so then she's like, something else happens in the scene. And then she's like, maybe I'll understand. The woman being interviewed, the author on the radio, is like, it's also particularly feminine form. And the narrator is obviously like, that's total bullshit. Total bullshit. And I was thinking a lot about Rachel Cusk. I love Rachel Cusk quotes, but Rachel Cusk has a line basically where people on Mumsnet, the mom forum, were criticizing her for her memoir, and one of the things that she says that they were saying about her was, how could a mother write such long sentences? And I was thinking about that, and about the notion that one has to write a fragmented novel because one has children. So
that's from Mumsnet, and it sounds ridiculous, but I've seen the highbrow version of that point made. Definitely,
that's true. And it's like, I'm like, this is just not, I don't buy, it's not right. So she's maybe I will, the transitional joke is, maybe I will better understand other women if I start writing in the fragments. And then she proceeds to write in fragments for 40 pages.
So something I'm curious about it is, it's sort of a critique of the form, or at least the way this being discussed, but then you do actually have to commit to it and do it. You do it for a long period of the novel. How did you, I mean, why did you decide to commit to it at that length? And did you end up feeling like, you know, like this was working for you in some way? Or like, there's a part where you say it's really easy to write like this. And you know, there's a kind of like critical passage in the middle of it. Was it frustrating? Like how easily those fragments came?
No, it was not. I mean, it made me understand why people do it, which I think the book is generally concerned with trying to understand difficult people and trying to sort of figure people out and to determine how serious they are. So a lot of the things where she's sort of embodying stuff that she hates or doing things that she doesn't like in order to critique them, this is just another sort of example of her doing that. At least that's how I see it. But yes, was it frustrating how easy they were? No, I would say it was extremely pleasant.
Satisfying.
I probably have like maybe, I don't know, 15 extra pages of those fragments sitting around somewhere. But and also at the point in the novel, I think it actually works. It ends up working because the narrator has moved to Berlin and she's sort of unmoored and she doesn't have anything to do, and she's sort of desperately looking for structure in her life. So she like takes this other person's structure and like tries it out and sees if it works for her. And it simultaneously is when she starts doing her OkCupid project, where she makes up a bunch of different personalities. So she's doing a bunch of different structures at once. And that's also astrology comes into play. And that's also how I see astrology, exactly. Which is like
in astrology,
arbitrary thing that you then lend a bunch of really grave significance, right? And you think it really says something about you when actually it doesn't say anything. It doesn't say anything about you at all, except that you like astrology.
Okay, I am going to go to questions now because we actually have a ton of questions and they seem very thoughtful.
Thank you guys.
So, okay, first one, this is from Molly Ware. I agree that Twitter is even crazier now than at the beginning of the Trump era. Did you have any hope that this is in scare quotes, discourse online would improve in the absence of both his account and his presidency, or is this new era clearly going to be just online?
I think something that you notice interesting, at least I notice, I mean, I pay a lot of attention to Twitter, but the absence of Trump means that there's really no organizing force on Twitter. So it's much more sort of chaotic, and there are a bunch of little things. And I think it's easier to sort of divest yourself from it if you want to, because it is more realistic, and that there's not like there's not a Trump news item every day for people to be clustering around and sort of bouncing themselves off of in various ways, right? And there's not like a Trump tweet, and there's not the possibility of either of those things really either. So from that perspective, Yeah, I do think we'll be less. It will just become different. But I think when I started thinking about this book, or I started having the experiences that led to this book, they were all extremely social and small and petty and banal. And I think that those sorts of things will continue happening regardless of Trump.
Okay, next question. This is from someone called Joel Bleschinger. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing that. Hi, Lauren. I'm about halfway through the book so far, and I'm really enjoying it.
Thank
I
you.
love your description of the protagonist's job as a blogger for a media site. How do you look back on the think piece era, on hashtag long reads, etc., when so much writing or content was generated, ultimately to drive traffic, but perhaps wasn't exactly criticism, which the protagonist is careful to differentiate from what she does in her job? What was the status of all that writing in retrospect? Do you think any/much of it is salvageable or worth salvaging? And then he ends the question, lol.
Hello.
So take that as you will.
I mean, I think probably some of it. Sorry, there are people in the hallway if you can hear that. So I think it depends. I think a lot of it's crap. I would say that a lot of it is like a way to fill people's time, both the people who are writing the blogs and other things and the people who are reading it. Like it's just a time filler. And I think quite a lot of us, middle class, more or less, we can debate the term middle class another time. Middle class, creative class people do have a lot of free time in the end, and that is the main indicator. That is the main point about all of that stuff. Will I think some of it survived? Sure. I think, I remember certain Gawker blogs, right? Whether really good or really terrible, they're going to exist in the minds of the people who will continue making culture until we all die and Gen Z brings TikTok with them and has weird memories of TikTok stuff. So yes and no, right? I think also for me, at least, I don't know, to be frank, like it was a great way to start my career. I didn't get paid anything at all at first, and I did other jobs, and now I have a novel. So it was a few of us found it rewarding, I think.
Okay, back to the questions. This is very appropriate for a novel that features this isn't a question, this is my commentary on the questions. A very appropriate question for a novel that features the line, "This is more of a comment than a question."
Oh yeah.
So the comment is, the novel Ben Lerner wish he wrote. I'm just going to leave that and move on to the question. Oh, you can react. You can react.
I said this in another event as well, because I think that people are really misreading my relationship to Ben Lerner, which is that I really think he's great. And I just need that to be on the record in case someone tells Ben Lerner that people were making fun of him in my name, which is wrong. Okay, keep going.
This whole thing is not about making fun of Ben Lerner.
Ben Lerner is in it though.
In what? In this?
He's in the, yeah, Leaving the Attention Station is in it.
Oh, of course. Yeah. Okay. You are making fun of him a little bit with that.
No,
I'm going to interpret it that way as the
my God.
You don't really get to say.
There's a study abroad student who is in Spain, and she's talking to the narrator who's like 10 years older than she is. And she's like, "Oh yeah, I love this novel, Leaving the Attention Station." And the narrator's like, "How do you know about that?" So she's really saying that it's not something that a weird study abroad student should know about. Anyway, tell Ben that I think he's great.
Okay, on to a question. This is from Micah Utrecht. I'm 2/3 of the way through the novel, and one thing that I'm struck by is that the narrator seems incredibly wrapped up in herself on multiple levels, to the extent that we not only see others as she sees them, but she doesn't even let them speak for themselves. The other characters say things, but we rarely read quoted dialogue. The dialogue's related back to us by the narrator through her voice with no quotation marks. I added to the overall feeling I got from reading the novel that I was living entirely in or almost trapped in the narrator's mind, which was not a place I particularly enjoyed being trapped in. Like Lauren, I found her a menace. Was this a purposeful choice? I think he means like the dialogue, and intended as a kind of commentary.
First of all, I think that a first person narrated, I find the idea that we are trapped in a person's mind to be very strange and something I never thought about until I wrote this, when people started saying it all the time. Because that's what I thought first person narration was, right? And I thought it was like a really honest approach to first person narration, which I was like, okay, what can she tell you and what can she not tell you? And to go back to the sort of journalism or fake journalism question, she's very rarely quoting things, I think, because she's speaking in retrospect. She's telling the story in the past tense, and I wanted it to be like, oh, if there's a quote, then she this is actually what they said. And if not, she's relaying it to you. So it's very sort of from her perspective, but I see that as being, that's the point. I guess is the short answer to all of this, right? Like, yes, it's from her perspective, and everything is, if Laura Marsh were narrating an 8-hour-long novel, it would be from your perspective as well.
That's a frightening thought. Okay, the person who made the Ben Lerner comment just chimed back in to say, oh, of course he's great, but we need to make fun of him. Okay, on to another question. This is from Chris C. What were some of the biggest challenges or most frustrating parts of writing the novel, and how did you address or avoid them? E.g., I couldn't make the scene work until I ...
Oh, okay, let's think. What were difficult? What was difficult is after he dies, and she is sort of confused about what she's doing, and she's sort of living in like without any constraints, more or less, and she knows that, and she's trying to decide what to do with herself. And I think I wanted it to be clear that she had gone to Berlin in order to sort of figure things out in this way without making it too cliche or making it sort of like eat, pray, love kind of, like she's gone to Berlin to find herself. And I wanted it to be like an anti-finding yourself abroad story, but trying to like get that middle section to do that without doing it too hardcore, I think was quite difficult. But all the scenes, I think writing all the scenes was really fun. I like to write a scene forever.
Next question. You mentioned you love first-person novels. What are some favorites and why? Sorry if I'm cheating. That's kind of 2 questions.
Well, I mean, I think there are so many great first-person novels, and then I'm going to say something. But I really like, let's see, who do I really like? I mean, I really like I really like the first-person Iris Murdoch novels. I really like the Margaret Drabble first-person novels. I really like lots of this sort of like, I don't know, like Elaine Dundee's books and other NYRB sort of with a female narrator. I think probably Barbara Coleman has some, I think. And now I'm like, what are the books I like? And let's like think about if they're first person or not. I think more recently, Ben Lerner's books, I think are really wonderful. And I like those a lot. I like The Idiot by Elif Batuman. I like, yes, I like Philip Roth when he's doing first person. Yeah.
Were there particular books that you kind of kept at your side when you're writing this, like touchstones? Or I don't know what your process is, whether you read a lot when you're doing the book or if you're just writing at that point.
I think that I don't have like a talisman or anything, so I don't think I was reading a lot. I think I was probably writing criticism during it, which is probably why you're getting all these sort of responses to contemporary literature within the book. But no, I think I read Mating. Also, Laura's in the Twitter Mating fan club.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
I think I read that right when I started, which you can see, I hope. And there's an oblique reference to it in there too, if you catch it. So thanks.
Yeah, that's an amazing example of like high octane first person.
Yes, she's actually that's my answer to the last question. The first person narrator.
I'm glad I got there. I was kept wondering.
I was like, there's something
that was in your mind. Yeah. Okay. I'm gonna do like two more and then we'll be done, I think. Let me see. Da, 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 da. Many of your articles have gone viral. You called these lily pads of virality in one interview. Do you think about virality in the breakneck and often overwhelming pace of internet discourse in writing fake accounts?
Did I think about virality? Yeah, I think virality is something generally to be afraid of, and for the narrator as a blogger, but then also not. Like, I think she develops a lot of her paranoia and her distrust and her so she's always sort of parsing implications from all sides, because I think she's very defensive, and probably a lot of it comes from the threat of virality, right? And I think if you've ever worked in digital media, that you probably have like a fantasy of going viral for something really good, but it doesn't. I guess it does. I mean, I guess it does happen. I don't know what counts as a viral, like a widely shared hashtag long read or something. But I was thinking more about the negative side effects of it for sure. But my experience of being viral, in as much as I have been, has been more. I'm always surprised at how little harassment I get in the aftermath.
Yeah, that's always a frightening thing to say. It
Yeah,
feels like
you guys
tempting
could be
fate.
way more meaner to me. Please don't.
Okay, so last question. This is kind of a Berlin question. So
Okay,
I like this
I love
one. Lauren, I love your reviews and I'm excited for this novel. Berlin is a city that culturally rejects social media. Can you discuss the choice of setting part of the book in Berlin and its significance in shaping the story?
Yes, I think primarily I think about the Berlin expat community, not Berlin as a whole. And the Berlin expat community is this very sort of cliquish, like insular, weird, its very nature sort of closed off, like little group within Berlin. And it feels very cosmopolitan, because you're going to art openings and you can like go to bars and see people that you know, and it's all very exciting. But actually there's, German, you're in Germany where they're mostly Germans. And I think within the expat community, there's so much sort of backbiting and like bickering about who is a real Berliner and who's a real expat, and who's really living here and who isn't, that I thought that it was a pretty good setting for her to be in, because it's the same kind of questions, but in a really like real world, quote unquote, scene. And also, I think a very sort of classic, but nevertheless needs to be said, like question about language and meaning and your ability to communicate with people around you becomes very literal in Berlin, where she doesn't speak any German and she sort of vacillates about whether she's really going to learn it because she doesn't want to stay there. So yeah, I think that is why. But do they reject social media? Yes, they do. It's very cool and remarkable. But sometimes you'll be on the U-Bahn and you'll hear girls like speaking in German, and they'll be like, da 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 da, what the fuck? And like it's sad to hear Germans like take horrible American internet slang and just incorporate it fully into their language without feeling too bad about it.
Okay, so that is all we have time for. Lauren, thanks so much for talking to us. I really enjoyed
Thank you.
this.
It was really great.
The book is out this week, or it just came out this week. It's called Fake Accounts. All right. Thank you so much, and have a good night, everyone.
Good night.